Yeah, so I'm going to talk today about the beginning of book one, and we're going to look at really one of the most rewarding but uncharacteristic sections of Thucydides, which is the first 23 chapters of book one. They're quite different from the funeral oration, and they're much read, obviously, because they're the first thing in Thucydides. Although Dionysius of Halicarnassus says you shouldn't read them first. He actually says you shouldn't read them at all. He said, if you skip the first 23 chapters, that'll be really good. You'll have a much better understanding of Thucydides' work. But if you're interested in historiography, those are the chapters you especially focus on. So I'm going to start out by talking about book one in general, and very, very briefly, because there's a lot that could be said about it. So these are the things I would say about book one. And I have actually written an article which has just come out in a companion to Thucydides. I wrote it like 7 years ago, but I still believe it, about book one as a prolegomena. It's a companion to Thucydides by Polly Low, L-O-W, which says these things in a little bit more fully and I hope coherently. But first of all, book one is separated from the rest of the work. In other words, it's cut off by Thucydides himself. The proper history of the war in summers and winters until about, the last 5-6 years of the war, where it breaks off, begins in book two. And it continues all the way from book two to book eight when it breaks off. Book one is not part of that. And Thucydides does not introduce that chronological scheme of year by year, summer and winter, until the beginning of book two. He has no single chronological scheme for book one at all, even though he does use historical narrative in it. And that's one of the things people have complained about book one. In the archaeology, he's talking about historical things. In the so-called Pentecontaetia, in the middle, he's definitely giving a historical account. And he's also talking about the beginning, the years just before the war in Corcyra and Corinth. But those three sections are out of chronological order in book one. They do not actually give many indications of date. So he doesn't really care about that in book one. He'll tell you, by the way, in book one, he'll tell you in the archaeology, such and such happened about 400 years before the beginning of this war. But he doesn't tell you when the beginning of this war is, which is really annoying. And then in the Pentecontaetia, in the middle, he says, one of the reasons I'm inserting this account of history before the war is because somebody who just published an account of it named Hellenicus has written about the same things, but he got the chronology wrong. But Thucydides gives you no chronology whatsoever in the following narrative. He just gives you a sequence of things. So book one is not actually something that I would recommend a historically interested person to start with. What it does do is serve as a prolegomena to the rest of the war, not chronologically so much, but in terms of content and in terms of different approaches to how a historical event comes into being, the different reasons, the different backgrounds that a historical event can have. It can have precursors, military precursors. It can have political precursors. It can have economic precursors, all of those things that can lead into it. Well, I said political precursors. It can have people who drive you into war, individuals who want the war to happen, ambitious politicians, things like that. And that's what he deals with in book one, in a disorderly way, in 5 basic sections. The first section is the archaeology and preface, and that's chapters 1 through 23. The next section is a mini narrative. It's like a story in itself of the conflict between Corcyra and Corinth in the years just before the war. And this is a small conflict that drew all of the larger powers into it. It's the whole Archduke Ferdinand and Sarajevo business starting World War I. The idea that a relatively small event can sometimes trigger conflicts among major powers. that lead to the equivalent of a world war. And that's what Thucydides thinks Corcyra versus Corinth, or even smaller, Corcyra versus Epidamnus, triggered in that book. And he tells that story in a very coherent way. Within its limitations, it's got a beginning and a middle and an end. It's a complete narrative in itself. It starts out with a small military conflict, and then escalates into a larger military conflict. And then the scene moves to Athens, where there's a set speeches. There's a speech by the Corcyrians, a speech by the Corinthians, telling Athens what it should do. Athens makes a decision. Then there is a sea battle, a major sea battle, which is the biggest sea battle in terms of ships involved in all of Thucydides, even bigger than the Sicilian expedition. And that sea battle is inconclusive. And then there's the aftermath, which is the beginning of sort of a Cold War between Athens and Sparta and its allies. So that's what that section accomplishes. And then come 4 speeches at Sparta, where the Corinthians, who are angry about what's just happened, summon all the anti-Athenian parties to Sparta to talk about going to war, a large-scale war. And those 4 speeches are very often read. They're magnificent speeches. The first one is by Corinth, and Corinth is very angry. It's not angry at Athens, who has just almost defeated it in a battle and who it thinks is evil. It's angry at Sparta, its own ally. And it rakes Sparta over the coals for being slow to act and uninterested in the affairs of its allies, and really asleep at the switch against Athens. And it's actually full of admiration for Athens about what a great foe it is. Yeah, Athens is going to eat your lunch, Spartans. And so it's read for that reason. It's also kind of a good example of a speech that an enemy that's doomed to defeat would give. In other words, the Corinthians kind of know that this is not going to go their way, and all they can do is talk about how amazing the enemy is. This speech is plagiarized frequently in accounts of opponents of empire. It's plagiarized by Tacitus when he puts things into the mouths of locals who are opposing the acquisitiveness and imperialism of the Roman Empire. It's put into the mouth of Tecumseh, the Indian leader, in fake histories of the conquest of the Indians by the acquisitive imperialistic Americans. So this speech is much read, but it's totally different from the previous section. It's followed by 3 other speeches, which are not quite as interesting, but still very substantive. Then next, comes the Pentecontaetia, which means the 50-year period. At this point, Thucydides says, all right, I've given the background of the war, but I've left out something that's very important. In chapter 97, he says, the growth of the Athenian Empire after the Persian War was really what caused this war. So now I'm going to narrate what happened since Herodotus and the end of the Persian War. He starts precisely where Herodotus leaves off and takes it up to Corinth and Corcyra, which was the second section. And he does that not in his normal style, which would have taken, this is a 50-year period, it would have taken another entire history, obviously, to do that properly. But he does it in a chronicle style by military engagements, one after the other, just to show how hostile Athens and Sparta and Thebes were to each other in the 50 years preceding the Peloponnesian War. This is very interesting historical material for the historian, but it also drives historians crazy because it's not properly documented by Thucydides. It's too brief. Then the last thing is Thucydides finally introduces some individuals. On the eve of the war, he finally introduces Pericles, who has been looming in the background but never really active throughout this whole book. And he has Pericles give a speech saying the Spartan diplomacy is just fake. They are ready to start war at any time, as in fact they have said earlier. He said, we are not going to start the war, but of course we're going to war. We're just going to buy some time with fake diplomacy. And Pericles says, war with Sparta is inevitable. We either can submit to them now, or we can fight for our independence and survive. And that carries the day. And he also puts out his strategy for the war, which is sea power, maintain the empire, and keep sticking it to Sparta by attacking them. And we will win. And he says, I'm confident that we have the resources and the strategy which will defeat Sparta. And that's the end of book one. The Athenians vote to go to war. The Spartans and their allies have already voted to go to war. All that's left is for the war proper to begin. And after that comes the summer and winters of the war, which constitute the rest of the history. So within these 5 sections, there are a lot of subsections. Even these unified sections, which are so separate from each other in every way, and in different styles, completely different styles. Thucydides isn't usually thought of as a versatile stylist of Greek prose, but he can imitate Herodotus better than any Greek prose composition I've ever read. There are passages in book 1, as later, that you will swear are by Herodotus. And some scholars have even said, well, they must be by somebody other than Thucydides because they're so different from his style. And so they invent names of people he could have stolen them from, as if Thucydides stole things from other people and stuck them in his history, if everybody knew it. But he's very different in all these sections. But each of the sections is a gem by itself, read by itself. Reading them together, you get a big headache. And one of the best gems of them all is the first section, the archaeology. The last thing I've put on this thing here is that they represent different modes of approaching historical writing. Analysis and argument, a complete narrative of a large event. This is Corcyra and Corinth. A formal debate on a question, a simple chronicle of military actions, and then diplomacy, embassies and responses. If you remember Herodotus used to have embassies going back and forth quite often to tell stories. This is where Thucydides imitates Herodotus quite a bit. Like Herodotus, he says, and so the Athenians sent this charge to Sparta, and they told this story. And then the Spartans sent back to Athens, and they told this story. Very Herodotian. And he uses this, by the way, to finish the Herodotian stories of Themistocles and Pausanias, the generals of the Persian War that Herodotus didn't tell the ends of. But we're concerned now with the first one, analysis and argument. Analysis and argument. I don't know if you've ever read a book or heard of a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's by an anthropologist, and in it he uses 5 or 6 different examples to show how civilizations thrive or decline. And it was a huge rage. I think it maybe won a Pulitzer Prize, and it was big at Cornell because they chose it as the book that everybody had to read. All the freshmen and all the faculty had to read one fall. It's very analytical, and it chooses things like Easter Island, what happened on Easter Island. He talks about Greenland, how the Vikings came to Greenland and put all these resources into it and then died out, and it came to nothing. He talks about Dominican Republic versus Haiti, 2 halves of the same island. So why did they develop so differently? They're in the same place. And so he does these thought experiments with these different places. And it's a very much admired book by some people, and it's a very much disliked book by other people. And Thucydides' archaeology is both admired and disliked for somewhat similar reasons.